Welcome to a Miss Marple mystery. A Christmas morning frozen in time, a church clock that stopped at 9:23, and a letter no one was meant to read. In a village where every whisper sounds like prayer, someone used faith to hide a crime. Miss Marple knows every saint casts a shadow. But before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The snow had come earlier than expected that December, a light, powdery fall that softened the edges of Street Mary Mead and muffled the usual noises of village life. Chimneys smoked, curtains glowed with candlelight, and the smell of mulled wine and roast chestnuts drifted through the lanes. It was the evening before Christmas Eve, and a group of local carolers had gathered outside the vicarage, their voices carrying faintly over the frosted hedgerows. Inside her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting needles gently clicking in rhythm. The old clock on the mantel struck 9, a precise, well-behaved sound. She paused for a moment, tilting her head slightly. The carolers had moved down the lane, their song fading, when another sound reached her ear, a distant, irregular knocking. It came from the direction of the churchyard. She frowned, listening. At her age, one learned to trust small instincts. The sort of sound others dismissed as wind or fancy was, to Miss Marple, the faint stirring of human mischief. Still, she did not rise immediately. Instead, she added a final row to her knitting and looked toward the window. Beyond the frost-laced glass, the world was still. By morning, Street Mary Mead was awake early. Snow had deepened overnight, and with it came the clamor of gossip. Mrs. Bantry had arrived at the post office breathless, declaring that poor Mr. Leonard Sims, the church organist, had been found dead near the vestry door. Frozen, they said, she whispered to a shocked Mrs. Price Ridley. But not just that he was holding the church key, and the clock inside had stopped at 9:23. The news spread like fire through the cold. Every villager had a theory. Some said Mr. Sims had fallen on the ice. Others whispered of heart failure or drink. But there was talk, too, of an argument he'd had only days before with the new curate, young Mr. Hatherley, who'd come from London and looked perpetually nervous, as though he'd misplaced something important. When Miss Marple appeared at the grocer's later that morning, wrapped in her old blue coat and a sensible scarf, conversation hushed momentarily. She greeted everyone with polite warmth, bought her tea and sugar, and asked very gently whether the vicar's wife was quite all right. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice, "though between ourselves, there's something odd about it. The vestry door was locked from the inside, and the key in Mr. Sims's hand didn't fit." Miss Marple nodded as if mildly interested. But in her mind, something had already begun to turn as softly and deliberately as her knitting needles. A wrong key in a dead man's hand, a stopped clock at 9:23, and that sound she'd heard the night before, not wind, not fancy, but something deliberate. She smiled faintly to herself. Christmas, she reflected, was a time for peace and goodwill, yet it had a curious way of bringing out the very opposite in certain people. And as snow continued to fall on Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew, though she could not yet prove it, that someone had chosen Christmas morning to conceal a very human sin. By the following morning, the calm charm of Street Mary Mead had given way to a kind of restrained hysteria, the polite, murmuring kind found only in English villages, where everyone knows everyone else's affairs yet pretends surprise when tragedy strikes. The narrow streets buzzed with speculation, and each household, from the grandest to the humblest, had already settled upon its preferred version of events. Some thought it divine punishment, others whispered darkly of revenge. A few, like Mrs. Price Ridley, claimed it was nothing more than a dreadful accident exaggerated by idle tongues. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was in her element. "I saw him only the day before," she told anyone willing to listen, "and he looked quite agitated, pale, distracted. He dropped his hymn book, poor man, and muttered something about forgiveness. I should have known something was wrong. Her audience nodded eagerly, delighting in the drama. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Reverend Clement was having a miserable morning. The police inspector, a heavy-set man named Graves, had been summoned from Much Benham and was already in possession of a notebook far too full for the Reverend's liking. He had questions about the vestry door, the position of the body, and the curious detail of the church clock. "Stopped at 9:23, you say?" Inspector Graves asked, tapping his pencil. "And yet the body was found at dawn. That gives us several hours unaccounted for. You're certain no one entered the church between then and morning?" "Quite certain," Reverend Clement replied. "The snow was untouched, you see. No footprints but his own. Miss Marple, who had arrived on a pretext of bringing scones to Mrs. Clement, sat quietly in the corner, her knitting bag resting beside her chair. She listened without comment, her eyes mild, her hands folded. To the untrained eye, she seemed merely a sweet old lady paying a neighborly call. But her mind, quick and sharp beneath that gentle exterior, was already sorting threads of information. "Curious thing," the inspector went on, "that he was holding a key that doesn't fit any of the church locks. Reverend, you're sure it wasn't from your own set?" "Quite sure," the vicar said. "All hours are accounted for." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "I dare say keys can be quite misleading." "Inspector," she said mildly, her tone one of innocent reflection. "So many of them look alike, don't they? My niece once kept a drawer full of old ones and could never remember which belonged to what. It caused the most dreadful confusion." Graves glanced at her briefly, faintly amused. "Very true, madam," he said with polite indifference, before turning back to the Reverend. "And this Mr. Sims, he lived alone, did he not?" "Yes," said the vicar. "In the cottage near the mill. He was a quiet man, fond of his music, rather melancholy of late." "Melancholy? Well," Mrs. Clement interjected softly, "his engagement was broken off not long ago. Miss Lydia Grant, the schoolmistress. There were difficulties." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for half a heartbeat. She had heard of Lydia Grant, a serious young woman with a sensible mind and an unflattering way of wearing her hair. Not the sort one would expect to be involved in anything dramatic. Yet human hearts, Miss Marple knew, were seldom as tidy as their owners' reputations. Later that afternoon, as the church bell tolled softly in the cold air, Miss Marple made her way toward the late organist's cottage. The constable stationed there nodded respectfully as she approached. "Won't do no harm, I suppose," he said, recognizing her. "Though there's nothing to see, miss." She smiled kindly. "Oh, I never see very much, constable," she said. "Only what others happen to miss." Inside, the cottage was neat but curiously impersonal. The air smelled faintly of candle grease and dust. A small stack of sheet music sat by the piano, some pages smudged as if handled in haste. Miss Marple ran her finger lightly over the keys. A faint echo hung in the silence, the ghost of some half-played hymn. A cup of tea, long, cold, rested on the mantel beside a photograph, a woman's face, smiling faintly, the edges of the frame, worn where someone's thumb had pressed too often. Lydia Grant, no doubt. Beside the photo lay an envelope, half hidden under a newspaper. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the newspaper's date, December 23rd. Yesterday. The headline was about the village choir's Christmas performance, yet the envelope unsealed bore the faint trace of handwriting in an elegant feminine script. She leaned closer, but did not touch it. "My dear," she murmured to herself, "you meant to post it, didn't you? But something stopped you." The sound of approaching footsteps made her straighten. Lydia Grant herself stood in the doorway, pale beneath her dark green hat. "Miss Marple," she said in surprise. "I didn't expect—" "Oh, you're with the vicar's investigation?" "Not officially," Miss Marple replied gently. "I only came to bring a few flowers. It's such a dreadful thing. At Christmas of all times." Lydia's composure trembled for a moment. "Yes," she whispered. "He didn't deserve well, whatever people are saying. He wasn't wicked, only weak, perhaps." There was something in her tone, an odd mixture of pity and defensiveness. Miss Marple noticed the small tremor of her gloved hand, the way her eyes avoided the piano. "Did you see him that evening, my dear?" Lydia hesitated. "I heard him play," she said softly. "I was walking home from choir practice. He was playing, 'O Come, Emmanuel.' I remember because he always slowed the last verse as though he wanted to make it last forever." Her voice faltered, and she turned away. "He must have stayed late." "He often did." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail quietly away. Outside, the snow was beginning again, delicate flakes spinning like whispered confessions in the air. She thanked Lydia and left, her thoughts calm but alert. That night, she sat once more by her fire, the clock ticking faithfully above the mantel. The village beyond her window glowed with lamplight and secrecy. She considered what she had learned: a wrong key, a stopped clock, a letter unposted, a tune lingering too long in an empty church. Her mind turned back to the sound she'd heard that night, that uneven knocking. It had not been a human hand on wood, she realized now. It had been something duller, more rhythmic, almost like a hammer striking against metal. The sort of sound one might hear if a stubborn lock were being forced in haste. At 8:30, there was a gentle knock at her own door. It was the vicar, his face grave but tinged with relief. "They've confirmed it wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "There was bruising on the back of his head. Someone struck him. And the key, it belongs to the church's old vestry, the one sealed off years ago when the new extension was built." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Sealed off?" "Yes. There's no entry now, just the stone wall behind the altar." She pressed her lips together thoughtfully. "How interesting," she murmured. "A door that no longer opens, and a man found dead holding its key." The vicar sighed. "Inspector Graves thinks it's all quite straightforward. He's convinced young Hatherley's involved. They quarreled the night before, apparently." Miss Marple's eyes softened with the faintest glint of pity. "Dear me," she said quietly. "How eager men are to see guilt where it stands neatly before them. But in my experience, the truth often hides behind something rather dull, a curtain, a cupboard, a commonplace habit no one thinks to question." When the vicar had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time staring at the fire, her thoughts weaving through the evening's revelations. Somewhere among these small, ordinary details, a clock, a key, a song, a letter was the pattern she sought. She could feel it taking shape like frost on glass, faint and intricate. Outside, the bells of Street Mary Mead rang out across the snowbound roofs, calling the village to midnight rehearsal for the Christmas service. Miss Marple listened to the chime with half-closed eyes. If the church clock had stopped at 23 minutes past 9, she reflected, then someone had needed it to stop precisely then. The time was not an accident. It was a message, and in the quiet glow of her sitting room, Miss Marple smiled very faintly, knowing that before Christmas morning dawned, she would find out exactly who had written it. The morning after the vicar's visit dawned cold and crystalline. The snow hardened into a fine crust that crunched faintly underfoot. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and looked out across the village green. The church spire stood pale against the winter sky, a single curl of smoke rising from the vicarage chimney. Street Mary Mead looked utterly peaceful, and yet, as Miss Marple knew too well, evil seldom disturbed the surface of things. It crept quietly beneath, disguised as duty, jealousy, or love. By 9 o'clock, the first of the day's visitors had begun to arrive at her cottage. Mrs. Bantry came bustling in without waiting to be asked, her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes bright with the thrill of gossip. "My dear Jane, you'll never believe it," she began breathlessly, unbuttoning her fur collar. "The police have arrested Mr. Hatherley the curate. Can you imagine such a thing? And at Christmas time. Poor boy looked quite pale as milk when they took him away." Miss Marple poured her guest a cup of tea, her expression calm, her eyes attentive. "Dear me," she said softly. "And what grounds have they for such an action?" "Well, they say there's evidence," Mrs. Bantry replied in a whisper of deep importance. "Apparently, Mr. Hatherley and Mr. Sims quarreled the night before. Something about church funds or choir arrangements, or perhaps Miss Grant, though no one dares say it openly. And someone saw a light in the vestry after 9 o'clock. It must have been him, surely." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the tiny eddies of milk swirl into the amber liquid. "It does seem very convenient," she murmured, almost as if someone wanted it to appear that way. Mrs. Bantry blinked, uncertain whether this was agreement or gentle contradiction. "Oh, but my dear, what other explanation could there be? The poor man was found with the key, after all." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, setting down her cup. "The wrong key." Mrs. Bantry, who had never been patient with puzzles, looked momentarily perplexed. But before she could respond, there came another knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. Miss Marple rose to answer it, revealing Inspector Graves, who stood in the cold with his hat pulled low and a dusting of frost on his coat. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice respectful but brisk. "I hope I'm not intruding. Thought I'd keep you informed, seeing as you seem to have a knack for observation." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple said kindly. "Do come in and warm yourself." He accepted the invitation, removing his gloves with the air of a man weighed down by unfinished business. "We've got young Hatherley in custody. Claims he's innocent, of course. Says he was home writing a sermon that night, no one to confirm it. But we found something in Sims's pocket that changes things. A note, half burnt, addressed to H. Seems our curate was meeting him after all." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone remained gentle. "And you believe that was the purpose of the meeting, to quarrel?" Graves shrugged. "Could be. Could be something else entirely. But the lad's story doesn't fit. He says he never went near the church, yet someone saw him walking toward it not long after 9. That's close to the time the clock stopped." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, gazing into the fire. "The trouble with time, Inspector," she said at last, "is that it is so easily tampered with. People rarely realize how much can happen in the space between one chime and the next." He looked at her with a faintly skeptical smile. "You've got a poetic way of putting things, Miss Marple, but in police work, we stick to facts." "Of course," she said mildly, "though sometimes the smallest fact, a thread on a coat, a word spoken twice, can tell one more than a dozen confessions." After he left, Mrs. Bantry turned to her with excitement and a touch of apprehension. "You don't really think the inspector's wrong, do you? Mr. Hatherley seemed such a quiet, harmless sort of person, but those are the ones, they say." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, they say so, dear, and sometimes it's true. But there is something about this business that doesn't quite fit. People do not go to church on freezing nights simply to quarrel, and if one does, one doesn't bring the wrong key." She spent the afternoon walking through the village, her small figure unremarkable among the bustling preparations for Christmas Eve. The scent of roasting goose drifted from open windows. The children of the choir ran laughing through the snow, their voices echoing faintly. To any observer, she was merely another elderly lady taking the air. But Miss Marple noticed everything: the way Lydia Grant kept her curtains tightly drawn, though her lamp burned late, the furtive glance exchanged between the vicar's maid and the verger near the post office, the fact that Mrs. Price Ridley's parcel of groceries included 2 tins of polish, though she was known never to clean her own floors. By dusk, she had stopped at the churchyard gate. The snow was undisturbed save for a narrow trail of prints leading to the vestry door, now cordoned off by the constable. Inside, the faint glow of candles flickered through the frosted glass. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze fixed on the church clock. It had been repaired that afternoon, and as the hands crept toward 5, it chimed with soft precision. 9, 10, 11, 12. The sound was strangely uneven, the last chime fainter than the rest. She turned away, thoughtful, when a voice spoke behind her. "You shouldn't be out here, Miss Marple. It's bitter cold." It was Lydia Grant, her face pale beneath her scarf, her expression wary. "I was only listening to the clock," Miss Marple said. "It doesn't sound quite itself." Lydia's lips trembled faintly. "Everything's out of tune, it seems," she murmured. "They're saying dreadful things about Mr. Hatherley, but he couldn't do such a thing." "You're fond of him?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Lydia hesitated. "He's kind and terribly lonely. They don't understand him here." She bit her lip. "But people never do they?" Miss Marple's eyes were kind but penetrating. "No, my dear, they seldom do. And when people misunderstand one another, especially in small places like ours, tragedy often follows." For a moment, Lydia looked as though she might say more, but then she turned abruptly, muttering something about the choir rehearsal. Miss Marple watched her go, the hem of her dark coat vanishing into the falling snow. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple wrote a brief note and sent it to Inspector Graves by a village boy. It contained only a few words. "Before you charge your suspect, examine the church clock and ask who last wounded it." An hour later, there was a sharp rap at her door. The inspector entered, his hat in his hand, snow clinging to his boots. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The clock's been tampered with. The gears were forced. Someone stopped it deliberately." Miss Marple nodded. "That explains the time of death, then. It wasn't meant to show when he died, but to conceal when he didn't." Graves frowned. "Meaning? That he died later?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Much later than 9:23. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then why would anyone bother? If the killer wanted to delay discovery, he'd have hidden the body altogether." "Not necessarily," she said. "You see, the right appearance can be more useful than concealment. A scene arranged to look convincing is often the neatest disguise of all, especially when one knows how eager people are to believe what they expect." Her tone was so calm, so assured, that for the first time the inspector looked uncertain. "Then who do you suspect, Miss Marple?" "Oh," she said, her smile faint and almost apologetic. "I never suspect, Inspector. I only observe. But I should very much like to know who had reason to want Mr. Sims found, and not merely found, but found before Christmas morning." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I'll make inquiries about the clock," he said, "and about the vestry keys. You've given me something to think about, that's certain." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire once more, her knitting in her lap. The village beyond was alive with the sound of bells and laughter, preparations for midnight service. Yet, beneath it all, she sensed something brittle, uneasy, as if everyone were waiting for the wrong truth to be accepted. She looked up at the mantel clock, listening to its gentle ticking. 9:23. The same hour that had been fixed in death, a time frozen by deceit. And in that moment, as the firelight flickered across her thoughtful face, Miss Marple began to see the shape of what had been hidden, a pattern faint as a watermark, waiting to emerge fully with one more thread pulled. Tomorrow, she thought, she would visit the church again, but not to pray. The next morning, a low mist lay heavy over Street Mary Mead, blurring the edges of roofs and hedgerows, and giving the village an odd, dreamlike stillness. The church bell did not ring. The police had cordoned off the building entirely, and the vicar had announced that morning prayers would be held in the parish hall until further notice. The villagers, of course, read this as both an inconvenience and a delicious source of new speculation. Miss Marple stepped out early, her boots leaving crisp, precise impressions in the snow. She walked with the unhurried air of a woman heading nowhere in particular, and yet each turn of her path was deliberate. She crossed the lane toward the church, her eyes following the faint lines of footprints left by the constable on duty. The mist muffled all sound, save the occasional caw of a distant rook. Inspector Graves was already there, standing near the vestry steps, coat collar turned up against the chill. He nodded when he saw her. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said without flourish. "The clock hadn't stopped by accident. Someone forced it to match their story." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "And whose story might that be?" The inspector hesitated. "That's the trouble, too many fit. The curate's out now, for the moment. Couldn't hold him without stronger evidence. But there's something else, something peculiar. We checked the key the deceased was holding. It's the old vestry key, as I said before, but the door it belonged to doesn't exist anymore. Only, we found a note from years back in the church register. That key was meant to have been melted down when the vestry was rebuilt. Yet here it is again, turning up in a dead man's hand." Miss Marple's brow furrowed ever so slightly. "Things that are meant to be destroyed but aren't often cause a great deal of trouble later, Inspector. Old letters, old grudges, old keys, they have a way of surviving when it would be far more convenient for them not to." He grunted in agreement. "We're tracing who last had access to the church storeroom where old things are kept. Could be someone found it recently. Could be coincidence." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Coincidence is such a comforting word, isn't it? It allows one to stop thinking too soon." The inspector chuckled. "You make my job sound lazy, Miss Marple." "Not lazy, dear Inspector, only hurried. There's a difference." They walked together through the churchyard. The frost glimmered faintly on the stones, and Miss Marple's gaze moved from one to the next, as though the graves themselves might whisper something useful. When they reached the far side of the church, she paused. There, beneath a small yew tree, the snow had been disturbed, a patch smoothed over hastily, though the shape beneath was unmistakable, the indentation of something rectangular, heavy, once half buried. Miss Marple bent slightly, touching the surface with her gloved hand. "A box," she murmured. "Perhaps a chest of some kind. Removed in haste, I think." Graves crouched beside her. "The groundskeeper said the soil was dug up this morning, thought it was rabbits. But that's no rabbit hole." "No," she said quietly. "And I'd wager whatever was taken from here has more to do with that old vestry key than anyone realizes." He straightened, calling for the constable to mark the area. Miss Marple, however, remained still. Her eyes unfocused for a moment. The pattern in her mind, faint before, was beginning to gain color. By midday, the mist had lifted slightly, revealing the neat outline of the village once more. Miss Marple made her way to the schoolhouse, where Lydia Grant had resumed her lessons despite her strained expression. The children were dismissed just as Miss Marple arrived, their laughter trailing down the lane like birdsong. Lydia looked startled to see her. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice subdued. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I'm afraid I'm a dreadful creature for disturbing people," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I was wondering, my dear, if you might help me understand something. You once mentioned hearing Mr. Sims play the organ that evening, didn't you?" Lydia hesitated. "Yes. Around 9, I think." "Ah, and you were certain it was him? Who else could it have been?" she replied quickly, though her tone carried more uncertainty than conviction. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, who indeed? Only it strikes me that the sound of an organ carries, doesn't it? One could hear it from quite far away, even from a recording device, if one happened to have such a thing." Lydia blinked. "A recording device? You mean the gramophone at the vicarage?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Sims was fond of mechanical gadgets, wasn't he? I recall him demonstrating that peculiar machine last Easter. It could be set to play a recording at any time of day, if wound properly." A silence settled between them. Lydia's hands twisted in the folds of her skirt. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "That, perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "What you heard that night was not a man playing at all, only his instrument echoing a ghost he had planned himself. A sort of alibi in melody." Lydia's eyes widened, then dropped to the floor. Then he meant to deceive someone? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps someone meant to use his little trick against him. When Lydia looked up again, her composure had begun to crumble. He wasn't a bad man, Miss Marple. Foolish, maybe, and weak, but not wicked. He said he was going to tell the truth that night about the money. The money? She nodded, trembling slightly. There was a sum missing from the church fund, only a small amount at first, but it grew. He told me he'd borrowed it, that he meant to repay it. He was terrified the vicar would find out, but then he said he couldn't go, on lying, that he would confess everything that evening before Christmas. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, though her eyes sharpened. And did he say, who else knew? Lydia shook her head. No one. He swore it. But I think someone overheard us once, after choir practice. The verger was cleaning the pews nearby. Mr. Hesketh? Yes, he's been at the church for years. He looks after everything, the keys, the heating, the registers. He would have known about the old vestry key, wouldn't he? Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He would indeed. She left Lydia soon after, her mind working briskly as she walked back through the village. The verger, Mr. Hesketh, was a quiet man, courteous, grey-haired, unobtrusive, yet Miss Marple had noticed that unobtrusive people were often the most dangerous. They knew how to blend into the background, how to watch unseen. And Mr. Hesketh had always been a great admirer of Mr. Sims's position at the church, though admiration could easily turn to resentment in the right conditions. She found him in the churchyard, oiling the hinges of the gate, as though nothing at all unusual had occurred in his domain. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hesketh," she said pleasantly. "I do hope you're keeping warm in this dreadful weather." "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "Trying to keep busy. The place won't look after itself." "So true," she said. "I imagine you know every corner of this church, don't you? Even the parts that no longer exist." He gave a small, awkward laugh. "Well, ma'am, I've been here since before they rebuilt the vestry, if that's what you mean." "Yes," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "I imagine you even kept one or two things that were meant to be thrown away. Keys, perhaps?" His hand stilled for the briefest second, then resumed its motion. "Can't say I recall, ma'am," the vicar ordered. "Everything cleared proper." "I'm sure he did," she said mildly. "Still, I suppose it would be easy to overlook something small, especially if it seemed harmless at the time." He looked at her for the first time, his pale eyes unreadable. "You've quite the imagination, Miss Marple." "So people often tell me," she replied. "But imagination can be terribly useful when facts are dull, don't you think?" He said nothing, only tipped his cap again and turned away. But Miss Marple's eyes followed him as he disappeared into the mist beyond the church wall. She felt a faint chill, and it wasn't from the weather. That evening, as the first stars appeared faintly through the frost, Miss Marple wrote another note, this time shorter than before. She sent it to Inspector Graves with one of the vicar's errand boys. It read simply, "Ask Mr. Hesketh where he was between 10 and 11. The clock will tell you the rest." And as she sat once more beside her fire, knitting quietly while the village lights flickered outside, she thought of the box-shaped hollow in the snow, of the clock stopped in false time, and of a key that should have been melted long ago. The pieces were aligning at last. There was only one thing she still needed to hear the truth in a man's silence. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as twilight deepened, his boots leaving wet patches of slush on the doormat. He looked more thoughtful than usual, his eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said without ceremony. "I took your advice," questioned the verger, Hesketh. "He swore blind he was home that evening, but his wife tells a different story, says he didn't come in until well after 11, claimed he'd gone to check the boiler in the church, though there's no sign anything was wrong with it." Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her lap. "Ah," she said, her tone one of quiet. Confirmation. And did he mention why he was seen near the old vestry wall that morning? Rather far from the boiler, I should think. Graves blinked. How did you? Well, yes. One of the constables did spot him there. Said he was clearing snow. Claimed he'd been told to by the vicar. But the vicar, of course, denies it. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. It's very trying when people clear away things that ought to be left alone, isn't it? Especially when those things happen to tell inconvenient stories. The inspector gave her a half smile. You talk in riddles, Miss Marple, but I'll say this, you've got a sense for where the dirt hides. I assure you, Inspector, I haven't, she replied, eyes twinkling. I simply notice where others have been a little too clean. He chuckled despite himself, then sobered. The thing is, I'm still no closer to the why of it. What could make a man like Hesketh kill an organist and go to such lengths to stage it all? The key, the clock, the rest. It doesn't add up. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting to the fire. Oh, I think it does, Inspector. But only if one stops thinking in terms of murder as a crime of passion. Some crimes are far more practical. A matter of saving face, or livelihood, or even property. He frowned. Property? Indeed. You said earlier the old vestry key should have been melted down, did you not? But it wasn't. Which means the door it once opened might still have led to something worth keeping or hiding. And we did find that patch of disturbed earth, didn't we? Graves nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. You think whatever was buried there was connected to the vestry? Almost certainly. Something that shouldn't exist anymore. And if Mr. Sims knew of it. She let the thought trail off delicately. Graves straightened, his voice low. Then Hesketh had a reason to silence him. Miss Marple smiled, faintly, though there was no triumph in it. Mary Mead is a very observant place, Inspector. You must never underestimate the collective mind of a village. Later that evening, when the inspector had gone, Miss Marple slipped on her coat and ventured out once more. The night was clear now, the mist gone, and the snow glittered like crushed glass under the lamplight. She walked with slow precision toward the churchyard, her breath forming little clouds before her. She passed the locked gate. The faint outline of the disturbed patch still visible beneath a thin film of frost. From within the church came a faint sound, the scrape of something metallic, followed by the unmistakable creak of a hinge. Miss Marple paused, her head tilted. She recognized that rhythm. It was the sound of the vestry door, the new one opening. Moving quietly along the wall, she approached one of the side windows. The glass was old and rippled, but through it she could make out a single figure moving in the dim candlelight. Hesketh. He was bent over something near the altar, his back to her, his lantern casting long, angular shadows. Miss Marple did not call out. She watched as he knelt, pried up a section of the stone flooring, and reached into the cavity below. When he rose again, something glinted faintly in his hand, a small wooden box, iron-banded, stained with age. He tucked it under his arm and extinguished the lantern. Miss Marple turned back, her expression unreadable. She moved as quickly as her years allowed, her boots making almost no sound on the frozen path. By the time she reached her cottage, she had already written another note for Inspector Graves. It was brief, as her notes always were. Come to the church now. Bring 2 constables. Tell them not to use the main door. The reply came in the form of hurried footsteps 10 minutes later. Together, they returned to the church, their lamps dimmed. The small door behind the belfry creaked open soundlessly, and Graves led the way down the narrow passage toward the nave. They found Hesketh exactly where Miss Marple had last seen him, kneeling beside the altar, the box open before him. He started violently at the sudden light, the constables stepping forward before he could react. "What's this, Hesketh?" Graves demanded. "Trying to rob the house of God?" The old man's face was pale, his hands trembling. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "I wasn't stealing. I was keeping it safe." "Safe from what?" "From ruin," he whispered. "It's the church's property, old communion, silver books, donations from the war years. Mr. Sims found it weeks ago. Said he wanted to tell the vicar, but he didn't understand. If the authorities knew, they'd claim it. It belongs here to us." Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone soft but steady. "And so you struck him down, to keep his silence?" Hesketh's mouth opened, closed again. "He wasn't supposed to die," he said hoarsely. "We argued, that's all. He came late, after playing that blasted record of his. Said he'd made up his mind to confess. I tried to reason with him, told him he didn't know what he was doing. He pushed past me, and He made a helpless gesture with his hands. He fell, hit his head on the step. I didn't mean it, but I couldn't let it look like what it was. So I dragged him outside, thought if they found him with the key, they'd think it was his doing." "And the clock?" Graves asked grimly. Hesketh's voice dropped to a whisper. "He'd already wound it, to match the time on that record of his. 9:23. I just left it. I thought it would help." There was a silence then, broken only by the distant ticking of the repaired church clock. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes on the box of tarnished relics. "Such a pity," she said softly. "A man who could keep the secrets of heaven and earth, yet not the truth of a single evening." The constables led Hesketh away without resistance. When the doors closed behind them, Graves turned to Miss Marple. "You saw it all before I did," he said quietly. "But tell me, how did you know he'd return tonight?" She smiled faintly. "Because, Inspector, men who hide things always go back to look at them. It's the one mistake they never fail to make." He nodded, understanding, though his face was troubled. "It's a sad business, this one. Poor fool. He thought he was protecting the church." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but protection born of fear is a dangerous thing. It turns conscience into convenience and calls it virtue." They left, together, locking the church behind them. The stars were sharp and cold above the village, and the faint chiming of the hour drifted across the frosted fields. The next morning, Street Mary Mead woke to find that the matter had already become yesterday's story. The villagers spoke of it in low tones over their morning tea, shaking their heads with sympathetic horror. By midday, their talk had drifted back to the Christmas service, to choir robes, puddings, and the weather. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her window, smiled a little to herself. It was the way of small villages, after all. Life resumed, neatly and without fuss. And yet, as she gazed at the snow-covered churchyard beyond, she thought of how narrow the line was between goodness and guilt, how easily one could become the other when wrapped in the right intention. She turned back to her fire, her needles moving once more. Another Christmas morning was coming, and the clock on her mantel ticked faithfully on, not stopping, not lying, simply keeping its quiet, honest time. The following day dawned pale and still, the snow glittering faintly in the weak winter sunlight. Street Mary Mead seemed at last to exhale after the strain of recent days. The church was closed, its doors sealed until further notice. The verger was in custody, and Inspector Graves had returned to Much Benham to prepare his report. For most of the village, that was the end of it. A tragic, regrettable affair to be whispered about until the next small scandal came along. But for Miss Marple, it was not quite finished. Something about it sat uneasily in her mind, like a stitch pulled too tight. She sat by the fire that morning, a cup of tea cooling beside her, gazing absently at the small clock on her mantelpiece. It ticked faithfully, its rhythm steady, unlike that dreadful one in the church, which had been stopped and started by deceit. She had always thought that time, in its quiet honesty, was the surest judge of character. And yet, she could not help but think there were still small pieces left unaccounted for. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock. When she opened the door, Lydia Grant stood there, pale but resolute. Her gloved hands were clasped tightly around a small parcel. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the strain she was under. "I didn't know who else to come to." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You look half frozen. Sit by the fire." Lydia hesitated only a moment before stepping in. She removed her gloves and held the parcel out. "I found this in my desk at the school this morning," she said. "It wasn't there before. I think someone slipped it in during the night." Miss Marple took it delicately. The wrapping paper was brown and ordinary, sealed with a bit of string. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook, old and worn, its pages filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Miss Marple turned a few pages, her sharp eyes scanning the lines. She looked up slowly. "This is Mr. Sims's hand, isn't it?" Lydia nodded. "I'd know it, anywhere. It's his ledger, the church accounts, the ones he said he'd lost." For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hiss of the fire. Miss Marple turned another page, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "So, he hadn't lost them. He'd hidden them." "I think so," Lydia whispered. "But why would he leave them for me?" "Perhaps he didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps someone else wanted you to find them or wanted to be sure I did." Lydia's breath caught. "You think there's someone else?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was still studying the ledger. The numbers were precise, but several entries had been scratched out, not clumsily, but with a deliberate neatness that spoke of calculation. "The missing funds," she murmured. "Hesketh claimed Sims borrowed them. But these figures, these corrections, they're not his doing. He was careless with sums, but not deceitful. Someone more orderly must have altered these books." Lydia frowned. "But who else handled the accounts?" "The vicar, of course," Miss Marple said absently, though I doubt very much he'd involve himself in arithmetic after dark. Still, others might have had access. The church secretary, perhaps. Or Mrs. Price Ridley, she's on the committee, isn't she?" "Yes," Lydia said slowly, "but she only oversees the flower fund." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, dear, those who oversee the smallest funds are often the ones who understand money best. The ones who count the collection plates rarely miss a penny." She rose, carrying the ledger to her writing desk. "I think we'll let the inspector know about this," she said. "But not just yet. There's something else to be learned first." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the vicarage. She found Mrs. Clement in the drawing room, trimming holly for what remained of the Christmas decorations. The vicar himself was in his study, writing letters of condolence. Mrs. Clement greeted Miss Marple warmly, if a little nervously. "My dear Jane, you look as though you've solved everything already," she said, attempting a laugh. "Oh, not everything," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only enough to know when something isn't quite over." Mrs. Clement's hands paused over the holly. "You mean Hesketh?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean the truth, my dear. Hesketh may have killed Mr. Sims, yes, but I don't think it began with him. And I rather suspect it didn't end there either." Before Mrs. Clement could reply, the door to the study opened, and the vicar appeared, looking tired but composed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. "I was just writing to the bishop. Such a dreadful matter on Christmas week of all times." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "You must feel it deeply, Reverend. Especially as you trusted both men." He sighed. "I did. Sims was misguided. I think his conscience was troubled. And Hesketh, poor foolish man, I can only suppose desperation drove him. He's been losing his sight, you know. I learned that yesterday." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Losing his sight, you say? That does explain a few things. Perhaps even the way he arranged the scene. He wouldn't have noticed the wrong key. Or that the snow would record his footprints quite so clearly." "Exactly," the vicar said, nodding gravely. "Tragic all around." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Tragic, though not quite complete. She left soon after, walking slowly down the lane, her mind busy with patterns and possibilities. The ledger's sudden reappearance bothered her. Why hide it, only for it to surface after Hesketh's arrest? Unless, of course, its presence was meant to tidy up the story, to close the book too neatly. When she reached her cottage, dusk had already fallen. A figure waited by her gate, Inspector Graves, his collar turned up against the cold. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "You've been busy, I hear. One of the constables told me you've got something new." She smiled. "Indeed. Come inside, it's far too cold to talk out here." When he'd settled with tea in hand, she showed him the ledger. Graves whistled softly as he turned the pages. "Well, I'll be. That clears the old man, doesn't it? If Sims was hiding this, it means he was guilty of embezzling the funds after all." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. It clears neither of them entirely and condemns someone else entirely, if I'm not mistaken." He looked up, puzzled. "Go on." She pointed to one of the entries. "Here. Look at the handwriting. It's smaller, neater, more deliberate. That's not Sims's hand. It's been altered after his death, or very near it." Graves leaned closer, frowning. "But who could have?" He stopped, his eyes widening. "The vicar." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "No, not the vicar. He's an honest man, though easily misled. But Mrs. Clement, she's clever, meticulous, and very devoted to her husband's reputation. She was in charge of tidying the vestry that morning, wasn't she? The same morning the ledger vanished." Graves exhaled. "You think she found it and fixed it?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that she found proof of her husband's mistake, perhaps a small misappropriation or an unauthorized expense. Nothing evil, only foolish. And she feared scandal. She thought if she removed the evidence and laid the guilt elsewhere, the matter would rest. But things rarely rest where deceit begins." The inspector rubbed his temple, troubled. "You're saying the vicar's wife planted the ledger?" "Not directly," Miss Marple said. "But she might have left it where she knew Miss Grant would find it, and so draw suspicion away from the parsonage. A woman's intuition is rarely wrong in matters of self-preservation." They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling softly between them. At last, Miss Marple said, "You mustn't be too harsh with her, Inspector. She's done something terribly wrong. Yes, but for a reason she believes good. That sort of sin is the hardest to untangle. It will unravel itself in time." He nodded, closing the ledger. "You're probably right, but I'll have to question her all the same." Miss Marple rose to see him out, her small frame lit by the firelight. "Of course you will," she said gently, "but perhaps do so after Christmas morning. Let her have her peace a little longer. There are so few moments of peace left in this world." When he was gone, she stood by the window, watching the snow fall once more fine and slow, covering the village in its fragile calm. Somewhere, a bell tolled faintly, and Miss Marple smiled to herself. Justice, she knew, came in many forms, not always in the courts or cells of men, but sometimes in the quiet workings of conscience. And in Street Mary Mead, that kind of justice would not be long in coming. Christmas morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost reverent. The sky was pale and clear, and the frost clung like lace to every window pane. In Street Mary Mead, the bells were silent for the first Christmas in memory. No carols drifted through the lanes, no organ swelled within the church. Yet life went on quietly, the smell of roasting goose, the faint laughter of children, and the low murmur of adults speaking in voices softer than usual. A shadow had passed through the village, but people, as Miss Marple knew well, were astonishingly adept at carrying on. She rose early, set her kettle to boil, and drew back her curtains. Across the green, the vicarage windows glowed dimly with candlelight. There was something mournful about that flicker, like a soul keeping watch when the rest of the world slept. She stood there for a long moment before dressing and venturing out. Her reason, she told herself, was to deliver a small Christmas pudding to the Clements. But in truth, She wanted to see how peace sat upon that household now. Mrs. Clement opened the door at once, her usual brightness gone, her expression tense but polite. "Miss Marple," she said with forced warmth, "you are too kind. Please, do come in, it's bitterly cold out there." Inside, the vicar sat at his desk, a Bible open before him, though he did not seem to be reading. His face was pale, thoughtful, his hands clasped loosely as though in prayer that had not yet begun. He looked up and smiled faintly. "A blessed Christmas to you, Miss Marple, though I dare say it doesn't feel much like one this year." "Blessed all the same, Reverend," she said gently, setting down the pudding. "It's in the nature of Christmas to come whether one feels it or not. Rather like truth, I find." Mrs. Clement's hands faltered as she poured tea. The faintest tremor passed through her posture, so faint one might have missed it if one hadn't been looking. Miss Marple noticed. "You mustn't think too harshly of what's past," she continued mildly. "People make foolish choices when frightened, especially when they're protecting something or someone dear." Mrs. Clement set the teapot down a little too quickly, spilling a few drops on the tablecloth. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she said, her voice too bright, too quick. "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, I found Mr. Sims's ledger rather interesting, not for what it contained, but for what it didn't. The missing entries, the altered handwriting. You must have thought it quite impossible anyone would notice, but then, you never could have imagined how often I've seen such things before. The smallest of falsifications, done out of fear, not greed. Heavy and long. The vicar looked from one woman to the other, confusion and dread dawning in his gentle eyes. "Clarissa?" he whispered. Mrs. Clement's lips parted, then pressed tightly together. She stood very still, her gaze on the flickering fire. "You don't understand," she said at last, her voice low. "He was going to ruin you, Leonard. Not just himself, you. If word had spread that the church accounts were mismanaged, even by mistake, you'd have been dismissed, disgraced. I couldn't let that happen. I only meant to correct what would have been misunderstood." Her husband rose slowly from his chair, disbelief etched in every line of his face. "You altered the records?" "I had to," she said, turning toward him, desperation breaking through her calm facade. "You don't know how they talk, Leonard. One whisper, one suggestion, and you'd have lost everything. And then that wretched man, Sims, came to me, threatening to confess. He said he'd show the books to the diocese. I begged him to wait, to let me speak to you first. But he wouldn't listen. He said he'd make it right himself. So I went to the church that night. I thought if I could reason with him." Her voice broke. The vicar sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Miss Marple remained silent, her expression one of quiet compassion. Mrs. Clement continued in a trembling whisper. "He was already in the vestry when I arrived, writing something. I told him he was mistaken, that it would ruin everything. He only laughed, said truth was more sacred than comfort. I don't even know how it happened. He tried to leave. I reached for him to stop him, and he fell. His head struck the corner of the step. It was over in a moment. Her hands trembled now, twisting the edge of her apron. I thought I could fix it. I fetched Hesketh, told him it was an accident, that no one must ever know. He believed me. He said he'd take care of it. I didn't ask how. I didn't want to know." The vicar raised his head slowly. His face was ashen, his voice hollow. "My dear, my poor foolish dear." Miss Marple sighed softly. "So, you see, Inspector Graves arrested the wrong person after all. Poor Mr. Hesketh did what he thought was loyalty, protecting his employers, not himself. And you, Mrs. Clement, did what you thought was love." Mrs. Clement's eyes filled with tears. "Will you tell him, Miss Marple? Will you tell the inspector?" "I shall tell him the truth," Miss Marple said quietly. "But not until after you've told your husband everything. It's not for me to decide what penance should look like. That's rather more in his domain." The vicar looked at her then. something weary but resolute flickering behind his eyes. "You're right, Miss Marple," he said softly. "As always, you're right. The law may have its say, but confession must come first." She rose, adjusting her shawl. "It usually does, in one form or another." Her gaze softened. "But take my advice. Both of you tell the truth fully, not half. Lies are like weeds. If you leave the roots, they grow back, as though the world itself wished to hide the ugliness of what had been unearthed." The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Children were laughing somewhere down the road, pulling a sled across the green. Life, inexorably, went on. When she reached her cottage, Inspector Graves was waiting by her gate. "I thought you might be out early," he said. His expression was grave but curious. "I've been turning things over in my head all night. The ledger, the timing, the confessions. Something still doesn't sit right, and I've a feeling you already know what it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Walk with me, Inspector." They strolled slowly toward the churchyard, the crunch of snow beneath, and their feet the only sound for several moments. "I think you'll find," she said, "that the true culprit was neither the organist nor the verger. Both were pawns in a rather sad little domestic tragedy. Mrs. Clement feared disgrace more than guilt, and Mr. Hesketh feared unemployment more than prison." Graves frowned. "You're telling me she killed him?" "I'm telling you," Miss Marple replied, "that she went to plead, not to strike. But fear is a dangerous companion in the dark. Accidents, when coupled with guilt, are very easily mistaken for murder, and vice versa." He looked at her, thoughtful. "I think," she said softly, "that sometimes justice is better served by mercy. If she confesses, truly confesses, she'll suffer far more than prison could make her. And perhaps, for once, that's enough." They stood in silence a moment longer, looking toward the church, its windows glowing faintly through the snowfall. Later that day, word spread quietly that Mrs. Clement had gone to the police station in Much Benham with her husband beside her. No one, in street. Mary Mead spoke of it directly. It was not the village way, but there was a quiet understanding among them. No one rang the bells that night, though the clock struck the hour faithfully, clear and untroubled. At home, Miss Marple sat by her fire once more, her knitting in her lap, the faint hum of carols from a wireless drifting through the wall from next door. She smiled to herself, a sad, small smile. The world had been put right again, not perfectly, but well enough. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the graves and the green alike, softening every edge. And in the hush of that gentle white silence, Miss Marple whispered, almost to herself, "There are no tidy endings, only honest ones." Then, with a quiet sigh, she reached for her tea, and the clock on the mantel ticked on steady. Uncorrupted keeping, time, as it always had, for all of Street Mary Mead. The following evening brought an air of strange quiet to Street Mary Mead, a quiet not born of peace, but of exhaustion. Snow still blanketed the village, clean and cold, hiding beneath its white stillness the memory of the scandal that had shaken every household. Miss Marple, as always, had become the unseen pivot of conversation. Her name passed in hushed admiration through the post office, over cups of tea in parlors, and in low voices outside the butcher's. "Imagine that dear old lady knowing everything before the police did," Mrs. Bantry said to anyone who would listen. "You could drop her in the middle of Whitehall, and she'd probably find out who's leaking cabinet papers within the week." But Miss Marple herself had no interest in gossip. The events of the last few days had weighed on her more heavily than she would admit. It was not the solving of crimes that tired her, it was what followed. The quiet human wreckage that always remained after truth was set loose. The Clements confession had changed the texture of village life in subtle ways. People walked more softly when they passed the vicarage. Others looked away, unwilling to confront what their curiosity had helped to uncover. That evening, as the church clock struck 6, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a letter open in her lap. It was from Inspector Graves. The handwriting was brisk, unembellished. He wrote to tell her that the bishop had accepted Reverend Clement's resignation with Christian sorrow, and that Mrs. Clement, though formally charged, would likely be spared imprisonment on account of her frailty and her husband's insistence that he shared her guilt. They will be leaving Street Mary Mead within the week. The letter ended. The parish will need a new shepherd by the new year. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. The church, without the Clements, that would change things more than most realized. The Reverend's sermons, gentle and unpretentious, had given rhythm to village life. Mrs. Clement's teas and her kind firmness had kept the parish ladies in a state of social harmony, or at least manageable discord. Without them, the small pretenses that bound Street Mary Mead together would come apart for a time, and Miss Marple, though she would never have said it aloud, dreaded the emptiness that would follow. A knock sounded then, hesitant and almost shy. She rose to open the door and found Lydia Grant standing on her step, a knitted scarf wound clumsily around her neck. Her eyes were red but dry, her voice low and steady. "I'm sorry to come so late, Miss Marple. I only wanted to thank you and to ask something I can't ask anyone else." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her to the fire. "You mustn't stand out in this cold. Sit down and tell me what's troubling you." Lydia perched on the edge of the chair, fingers twisting in her lap. "I can't stop thinking about that night," she said softly. "I know it's over or supposed to be, but something won't leave me alone. There's one thing I can't make sense of." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "Go on." "You see, when I was walking home from choir practice that evening, I passed the church at about 8:30. I told you before I heard the organ playing, that same hymn, O Come, Emmanuel. Only, it wasn't quite right. The rhythm was strange, halting as though the notes were struck by someone uncertain. I thought then that it was Mr. Sims playing, but now I'm not sure." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharpening with that almost imperceptible glint that came when a loose end began to tighten. "You're quite certain it was 8:30? "Yes," Lydia said. "The church clock had just struck. I remember because I counted the chimes as I passed." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working in neat, deliberate turns. "Then that is very curious indeed," she murmured, "because the gramophone that played the organ record the one Mr. Sims had prepared was set to begin at precisely 9 o'clock. The timer on it was found in the on position, so if the hymn was heard earlier, it could not have been the recording." Lydia's brows furrowed. "Then it wasn't the recording?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It was someone playing, someone who wished to create the illusion of Mr. Sims being alive at that hour, though he was not." Lydia's eyes widened. "You mean someone was already in the church before he died?" "Precisely." Miss Marple's tone was almost gentle, but her mind was alive with sudden, crystalline clarity. "It means that when Mrs. Clement entered the vestry, she did not find a man writing by candlelight, as she said. She found a man already dead, and someone else had been there before her. For the first time in days, a thrill of cold purpose ran through her. She rose abruptly, setting her shawl about her shoulders. "You've done a brave thing, my dear," she said to Lydia, her voice calm but quick. "Now, I think we must visit the vicarage once more before they leave." By the time they reached the vicarage, dusk had fallen again. The lane hushed under its pale snowfall. The windows were dark except for the warm, wavering glow of a single lamp in the study. Miss Marple knocked softly. It was the Reverend who answered, his face lined with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said, with a weary kindness. "I thought we had spoken our last on the matter." "So did I," she said, stepping inside. but I fear something has been overlooked, something rather important." He hesitated, then ushered them in. Mrs. Clement was there too, seated near the fire, a suitcase half-packed beside her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by shame. Miss Marple took her seat opposite, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Mrs. Clement," she began softly, "there's one thing I must ask. You said you went to the church to reason with Mr. Sims, that he was writing something when you arrived. But I've just learned that someone heard the organ playing at 8:30, a full half hour before Mr. Sims was supposed to be there. Can you tell me who else had the keys to the church?" Mrs. Clement frowned faintly. "Why?" "Only Hesketh and my husband, I believe, and, of course, Mr. Sims himself." The Reverend's eyes flickered uneasily. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "surely this can wait. My wife has suffered enough." "I dare say she has," Miss Marple replied gently. "But truth is not a matter of comfort, Reverend. I think we both know there was more at work that night than fear or folly." Her tone carried a quiet authority that silenced the room. "You see," she continued softly, "the organ was played by someone who knew how to use the machine, someone who had helped Mr. Sims with it before. That was not Mrs. Clement, nor the verger, nor yourself, Reverend. But there is one person who had both the technical skill and the opportunity." She turned her gaze toward him then, and in that long, measured silence, he looked away first. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "you don't understand." "Oh, but I do," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. "You went there first, didn't you? You found the man ready to confess, and you pleaded with him not to. It was your own oversight in the accounts that began it, some small reallocation of parish funds, perhaps for a charitable purpose the diocese wouldn't have approved. You meant no harm, but Sims was a man of scruples. He intended to expose the truth, and you—" He closed his eyes. He refused to listen. "I only meant to stop him leaving. I caught his arm. He stumbled, struck his head. I thought, and he'd recover. But—" Mrs. Clement's cry cut through the air. "Leonard, no." He turned toward her, his expression strangely peaceful. "It's all right, my dear. You were trying to save me, and I let you. I let you carry the guilt I earned. I am the one who killed him." Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes soft but steady. "So it was," she said quietly. "I thought as much. The handwriting in the ledger was too neat to be a woman's disguise. It was a clergyman's hand, deliberate, measured, used to parish records. You forged the alterations yourself." The vicar bowed his head. "I did." For a long time, no one spoke. The snow fell softly against the window panes, the sound like the faint hush of forgiveness the world sometimes grants the weary. When she left the vicarage at last, Lydia walking silently beside her, Miss Marple felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only inevitability. Truth, she reflected, had its own seasons. Like the frost and the thaw. It came when it was due, and it rarely spared those who waited too long. As they reached the green, the clock struck 9, clear, unbroken, honest. Miss Marple paused and looked up at it. "At least," she murmured, "it keeps the right time now." Lydia glanced at her, puzzled, but Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "My dear, never fear the truth. It has a dreadful way of hurting the guilty and healing everyone else." And as they walked on, their footsteps soft against the snow, the village settled back into its quiet winter rhythm, holding its secrets and its peace beneath the ever-faithful ticking of time. The morning after the final confession was a strange one, clear, quiet, and almost painfully beautiful. The storm had passed, and the snow on the green shone under the pale sun like powdered glass. Yet beneath that beauty, Street Mary Mead carried the hush of something unresolved. A scandal, once named and spoken aloud, doesn't vanish, and with confession It lingers in half-finished sentences, in glances exchanged across church pews, in the strained silence of polite company. Miss Marple knew this well. She had seen it too many times before, truth rippling outward like a pebble in still water, disturbing everything in its reach. Still, she hoped the Clements might find a kind of peace before they left. She had walked that morning to the vicarage, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. A final visit, she told herself, before Christmas week truly ended. When she reached the door, however, she found it already open. The vicarage cat sat on the step, tail curling lazily in the cold air, as though waiting for someone who would not return. Miss Marple stepped inside, calling softly, "Mrs. Clement?" There was no reply. The air was heavy with the scent of extinguished candles and the faint trace of burning wood. She moved through the corridor quietly, her shoes making almost no sound on the worn carpet, until she reached the study. There, on the desk, lay 2 letters sealed with care. One bore her name. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "My dear Miss Marple," it began, "it is impossible to thank you enough for what you have done, though it may seem strange to thank the person who has uncovered our undoing. You have restored truth to a place that had forgotten it. Yet I find I cannot face the long road ahead, not through courts, nor through disgrace. Clarissa is ill. Her heart will not bear it. By the time you read this, we shall be on the early train to Bath, and perhaps beyond. Whether to exile or to mercy, I cannot say. Pray for us, as I shall for you. Yours, in faith." Leonard Clement. Miss Marple stood very still for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the faint rattle of the milk cart in the lane, the world already turning toward its ordinary business. But something in her chest tightened a quiet sorrow she would not allow to become self-pity. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. When she looked again around the room, she noticed a small detail that most would have missed: a faint outline on the desk where something rectangular had rested, the dust around it disturbed. The ledger, the one that had carried all their guilt. It was gone. Later that day, Inspector Graves arrived, his manner brisk, but his expression wary. "Gone, are they?" he said, after she had shown him the letter. "Well, I can't say I'm sorry. There's no good to come of dragging it through the papers. It's a sad case, and better left as it stands." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, perhaps. Though I wonder if leaving things buried is ever as easy as we hope." He frowned slightly. "You think they'll come back?" "Oh, no," she said. "Not them. But there's something still here, unfinished." That night, she sat by her window long after most of the village had gone to sleep. The snow reflected the moonlight, turning the green into a pale, glowing sea. Somewhere beyond, the church bell tower stood silent, its clock face faintly gleaming. It had not tolled since the tragedy, though she knew its gears still turned. Then, quite suddenly, she saw it, a flicker of light from within the church. Not candlelight, not fire, but the steady glow of a lantern moving slowly down the aisle. She rose at once, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and stepped out into the cold. The air bit at her cheeks as she crossed the lane, her breath coming in short, white bursts. The church door, though locked earlier that day, was now ajar. Inside, the air was still and cold, carrying the faint, familiar scent of dust and brass polish. The lantern rested near the altar, beside a tall, stooped figure in a long coat. For a moment, she thought it might be the vicar returned, but when he turned, she saw it was Hesketh. "Good evening, Mr. Hesketh," she said calmly, though her heart beat fast. "I wasn't aware you were," and released. He blinked at her, startled but not fearful. "Miss Marple, they let me go this morning, said I was free. The inspector came himself, told me it was all cleared up." "And yet you've come back," she said gently. "To what end?" He hesitated, then gave a small, weary sigh. "I couldn't leave it like this. They all think it's over, but it's not. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about things that ought to have been melted down but weren't. I remembered there was another key, The key to the old vestry's foundation chest. I hid it years ago. Thought I'd be doing the church a favor. But maybe it was a sin after all. He bent down, lifting a loose stone from the floor. Beneath it lay a small brass box, tarnished and ancient. He set it on the step, his hands trembling. "It's all here," he whispered. "The papers, the money from the war fund, everything the old rector hid away when the vestry was rebuilt. I couldn't bear to part with it. It was the church's past, you see. I thought if I kept it safe, it would be remembered." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "And Mr. Sims found it?" "Yes," he said hoarsely. "I showed him one night, thought he'd understand. But he wanted to tell the diocese, to set it right. Said it wasn't ours to keep. We quarreled. I thought he'd gone home angry, but—" He faltered. "Now I see he never left the church alive." She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "You've done wrong, Mr. Hesketh, but not out of malice. It's over now. Let the past rest." He looked down at the box, then back at her, his face lined with years of guilt. "Will it ever rest, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "If one tells the truth fully, without keeping the smallest piece, yes, I think it does." He nodded slowly, as though her words had lifted some great weight, then picked up the box and placed it in her hands. "Then I trust you with it. You'll know what to do." When she returned home, dawn was already beginning to lighten the horizon. She placed the brass box on her table, opened it, and found inside exactly what she expected: bundles of faded papers, church seals, and beneath them, an envelope yellowed with age. Inside that envelope was a letter written in a hand she knew well, the old rector's. It was brief, a note explaining that the funds had been diverted during the war to shelter evacuees, that the vestry was rebuilt using unrecorded means for the good of the parish, and that whoever found this chest should not expose the matter but preserve its secret until such time as truth may serve rather than destroy. Miss Marple sat back, the faintest smile touching her lips. "So it was all a circle," she murmured. "Deception, to protect goodness, and goodness that bred deception. How very human." Later that morning, she sent for Inspector Graves and placed the chest before him. "The story's finished now," she said simply. "You'll find all the answers in there, and perhaps, this time, no villains at all." He looked at her in quiet respect. "You've an odd way of finding mercy in the darkest places, Miss Marple." She smiled. "I only look closely, Inspector. People, like clocks, rarely stop without reason." When he had gone, she sat once more by her window, watching the faint curls of chimney smoke rise into the cold air. The bells would ring again soon. She knew the parish committee would see to that. A new vicar would come, and the village would forget in time. But somewhere deep within the old church, truth had finally been set right, not loudly, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. As the first sound of distant bells drifted through the frost, Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her thoughts calm, steady, untroubled. The village clock chimed 9, clear, perfect, and faithful once more, and for the first time since Christmas Eve. Miss Marple smiled and whispered softly, "All in its proper time." The bells rang again that Sunday morning for the first time since the tragedy, though their sound seemed softer now, as if even the air of Street Mary Mead remembered too much to celebrate too loudly. People emerged from their cottages, wrapped in scarves and mufflers, their breath clouding before them as they walked toward the church. There was no vicar yet, only a temporary curate from Much Benham, a nervous young man with a voice that cracked when he spoke. But still, the villagers came. Habit, Miss Marple thought, was one of the most steadfast forms of faith. She watched from her window as they passed Mrs. Price Ridley clutching her hymn book like a shield, Colonel Melchett walking stiffly beside her, Mrs. Bantry whispering with visible restraint to Miss Hartnell, who was clearly dying to ask questions she shouldn't. Life, it seemed, was already reassembling itself, the loose threads pulled back into place. But the weave would never be quite the same. Miss Marple, though she had been invited, did not attend the service. Instead, she sat by her fire, writing a letter of her own, one not to be sent to any official or friend, but to the vicar himself. She wrote with deliberate calm, her pen moving neatly over the page. "You once told me, Reverend, that truth must be spoken, even when it wounds. But I have learned, over many years, that truth is a living thing. It changes, softens, and sometimes knows better than we do when to speak and when to wait. You and your dear wife have paid dearly already. I shall keep your secret safe, as I believe heaven will too." She sealed the letter and placed it inside the old brass box before giving it to Inspector Graves later that afternoon, when he stopped by with a final report. He stood by the fire, cap in hand, looking far more comfortable in Miss Marple's cottage than he would ever admit. "It's been quite the affair," he said at last, shaking his head. "You'd think a quiet place like this would be free of such things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, wickedness and goodness live side by side everywhere like holly and ivy. One scratches, the other softens." He chuckled quietly. "You're a philosopher as well as a detective." "I assure you," she said, "I am merely observant. People are remarkably consistent when you watch them long enough. They sin in familiar ways, pride, fear, self-deception, only the surroundings change." The inspector nodded, gazing out the window at the snow still thick upon the green. "I've been thinking about what you said about mercy. I don't suppose I'd call it my job to be merciful, but sometimes I think it's the only thing that makes the job bearable." Miss Marple smiled again, her eyes soft with approval. "Then you're a wiser man than most who wear that uniform." He inclined his head in modest acknowledgement, then hesitated before saying, "One last thing about the verger. He's leaving Street. Mary Mead, too. Going to stay with a cousin in Exeter. Said the place holds too many ghosts. You wouldn't happen to know what's in that box, would you?" Her knitting needles clicked softly in the silence that followed. "Oh, just a few records of human frailty, I imagine. Nothing that would interest a policeman, though quite a lot that would interest Providence." He laughed under his breath, then thanked her and took his leave. When the sound of his footsteps faded down the lane, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose. The house felt too still. She stepped outside into the fading light of afternoon, the air sharp but clean. Across the lane, the church door stood ajar once more, left open after the morning service. She crossed the snow slowly, her boots making small, deliberate impressions. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wax and pine. The congregation was gone. Only a few stray hymn sheets lay scattered on the pews. She moved to the front, her eyes lingering on the altar, where so much had begun and ended. The new curate had left a vase of evergreen branches beside the pulpit, simple, humble, alive. And there, beneath the branches, her gaze caught something small, a folded scrap of paper tucked between the leaves. She hesitated before reaching for it. The handwriting was unmistakably the vicar's, for Miss Marple. "Should this reach you, know that we are safe. Clarissa grows stronger by the day. We have found refuge in Bath among kind friends who ask no questions. I do not know what our future holds, but I pray that time, like the tide, will wash away the sharpness of our sins. You were right, truth, spoken too late, still saves. L." She stood for a long moment, the note trembling slightly in her hand, her heart lifting in quiet relief. Not joy exactly, that was too youthful a word for the feeling, but something gentler, steadier, a sense of rightness restored, if not triumph. She replaced the note carefully beneath the evergreen boughs and sat in one of the pews. The church was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above, now fully repaired, its hands steady at 4:30. Outside, faint footsteps passed villagers walking home for tea, their voices soft, their lives moving on. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the faces of all those who had played a part in the story. Mr. Sims, earnest and flawed, poor Hesketh, clinging to his notion of faithfulness, the Clements, bound together by love and fear. Lydia Grant, whose quiet courage had unstitched the last lie. Each had been guided, in the end, by something painfully human. And though it had ended in death, there was grace in it, still imperfect, but real. When she rose to leave, the last light of day was slipping through the stained glass windows, bathing the pews in muted reds and golds. The snow outside had begun again, soft flakes drifting lazily past the colored panes. Miss Marple paused by the door, looked back once more, and whispered under her breath, "Rest, all of you. It's Christmas still." That evening, she invited Lydia for tea. The young woman arrived wrapped in her green coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You've heard?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lydia nodded. "Yes, the inspector told me they were safe. It's strange, I keep thinking I'll see Mrs. Clement in the school garden, calling the children in from play. Everything feels the same and not the same at once." "That's how truth works," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "It leaves the world exactly as it was, yet nothing is ever quite unchanged." They spoke for a while of small things, the choir's plans for Epiphany, the price of coal, the thaw that would soon come. But when Lydia rose to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "do you ever wish you didn't notice quite so much?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, my dear, but I think noticing is rather like breathing once one starts. It's difficult to stop. And besides," she added, her eyes twinkling, "someone must keep watch over human nature. It has a habit of wandering off when no one's looking." Lydia laughed, though there was a trace of sadness in it, and she squeezed Miss Marple's hand before stepping into the darkening street. When the door closed, Miss Marple returned to her chair, the fire glowing low. She took up her knitting again, the steady rhythm soothing her thoughts. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft, endless, and forgiving. The world, she reflected, had its ways of covering what it could not undo. And when the church clock struck 9, clear, perfect, and unwavering, she smiled to herself, knowing that life in Street Mary Mead, for all its secrets and shadows, would go on exactly as it always had, quietly, imperfectly, and under the watchful eyes of those who still believed that, in the end, good always found its proper place.